Welcome everyone to Exposure Controls, possibly the most important section in this entire class. All right, in here we're going to be looking at all of your exposure controls, things like your shutter speed and aperture, which is controlled mostly by the mode dial, your ISO, exposure compensation, and a number of other tools to make sure that you get the correct exposure. Let's dive in. First up is the mode dial on the top of the camera. This is how shutter speeds and apertures are going to be determined on how you set them. So it's one of the key settings here. Now this does have a lock feature that has a push to turn, so it is kind of always locked and you have to push down on that button in order to engage it. So it's kind of a 2-3 finger affair in order to get it to move around. And that's kind of a nice safety way to make sure that it is always in the correct spot. Let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at what we have. We're going to start simple and get more advanced as we move along here. First up is the full green auto mode. Now this is the type of mode that I kind of hope that all of you don't need. This is the type of mode that you put the camera in when you give the camera to a friend or somebody else to take your photo or to take some simple basic photos. And the idea is that the camera is going to set shutter speeds and apertures for you automatically, and it's not going to allow them to make many mistakes. Now, to make sure that this is really fully automatic and in the correct mode, on the back of the camera we have a collar that switches between photo and video. And clearly we're talking about photo mode here, so make sure that that is in the photo mode as well. And since we're kind of covering dumb mistakes here, the lens can be put into autofocus or manual focus, and that is the master control for focusing on this camera. So make sure that that is in autofocus if you want kind of the full simplistic auto operation here. So once you have those two things set up and the camera in the full auto, then you're really good to go. So once again, the idea here is the camera is going to be setting all the major exposure parameters for you: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And what it's going to do is it's just going to try to look at how much light is coming in the camera. It's going to try to make sure that you have an appropriate shutter speed for hand holding the camera and for basic action to make sure that nothing's going to be blurry in the photograph. Now, there are a lot of what I like to call child safety locks when the camera is in this mode, which is something that will frustrate experienced users like you and me, because you can't get in and do all the normal things that you would normally do on the camera. That's why it's good in the hand over to somebody else mode. Now you can press the I button on the back of the camera for a few simplistic features. So let me go ahead and show you that. So I'll turn the camera on, and actually let's go ahead and turn the camera into the auto mode right here on the top of the camera. So we have the full mode here. And then let's go ahead and take a look on the back of the camera. And if we press the I button here, we're going to get into this I menu. And we're going to talk more about this later on in the class. Just right now I want to give you a quick tour. You'll notice that there's a number of grayed out items. And these are things that you're not allowed to play with when it's in this simple auto mode. You can go ahead and change the image quality and work a little bit with the flash, wireless connection, release mode. Some other things that we're going to be talking about here. We're not going to really dive into anything. I just want to show you how to navigate and the fact that some of these things are grayed out, but they won't normally be when you are in a normal mode, shall we say, up here on the top of the camera. Now, while we're in the auto mode, you'll notice down here the camera is setting our shutter speeds, our apertures, and the ISO is actually fluctuating a little bit right now, depending on how much light is coming in the camera. So it's trying to give us a reasonable shutter speed. Right now the aperture is fully open, and this will change according to the light situation that you have. So full auto, very easy to use, but limiting in your creative control. So let's dig a little deeper. Next up is the program mode. Now this is a pretty good simple mode for you and me, shall we say, when we want to put the camera in an easy, quick shot mode, but we still want to have access to a number of the features. So the main things are shutter speeds are automatic, apertures are automatic. ISO is kind of a separate subject. We're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. You can set it manually or you can have it automatic, your choice in here. the I menu, the regular menu, all the other features fully accessible in the program mode. So the program mode, what is the program? That's a good question. The program is to set shutter speeds and apertures kind of for all situations. And so it's obviously reading the light coming in, and it's once again trying to give you a shutter speed that's fast enough to handhold a camera and to stop basic movement. And so you'll see that when you look through the viewfinder at the bottom of the image area, you're going to have some information, and you'll have the mode on the left, and then you'll have your shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. And you kind of want to keep an eye on those to make sure that they're appropriate for the conditions that you're shooting in. And so one of the nice things about program is that you do have some manual control in here. So what you can do is you can turn the main dial on the back of the camera to do what's called a flexible program mode. And the idea here is that you can switch shutter speeds and apertures a little bit to different settings. So let's go ahead and take a look at what goes on. First off, let's go ahead on the top of our camera and switch it into the program mode. Next, let's go ahead and turn it around and look on the back of the camera. We're going to see that we got the camera in the program mode. Right now, we're at a 60th of a second at f4. I'm going to kind of step ahead a couple of steps here, and I'm going to change the ISO out of auto, and I'm just going to bump it up to 1600. Let's go 3200 just to see where we are. So right now, in here with the light that we have in the studio, the camera's recommending a shutter speed of 400th of a second at f5. Okay, well, that's a pretty fast shutter speed. Maybe we don't need that. Maybe we want a little bit more depth of field. Well, by turning the main dial on the camera, we can have less depth of field this direction, or we can go left and get more depth of field. Now you'll notice, top left corner, on the back screen at least, you'll have a little asterisk by the P, which means you have changed it from its normal programming mode. Any of these settings will get you a correct exposure, but they're giving you it in different ways. So let's say you want more depth of field. Well, you could come over here to f11, it's down at an 80th of a second, and you're pretty good. But you will notice that if we were to rotate the camera a little bit to get some darker areas of the studio, it's changed because it's trying to give us the correct amount of light. It can't lock in on any of these numbers. And so when you do this flexible program, it's not a definitive go here. It's more like go to that general area and try to do a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that. And so it's going to be a little bit frustrating if you were to say try to shoot sports photography, put the camera in the program mode and go, yeah, I kind of want faster shutter speeds. As soon as you pan over to a darker area, it might drop out of those faster shutter speeds. So it's good for more simple situations where you're not too particular about exact shutter speeds and apertures. All right, next up on the list is shutter priority. So obviously here you get to set the shutter speeds manually. The camera will then set the apertures according to what the light reading coming in the camera dictates for getting a proper exposure. Now this could be handy when you know you need a specifically very fast shutter speed, to stop some very fast action. Or you want to slow it down because you want to show motion. Both of these are great techniques with photography for showing different types of subjects in different ways. Now with shutter priority, there is a bit of an issue that you do need to be aware of, and that is that the camera has a lot of shutter speeds and lenses have a limited number of apertures, which means you can choose a shutter speed of which there is no appropriate aperture on your particular lens. So keep an eye on your aperture setting, and if it is blinking, that is a major problem. All right, so let me go ahead and show you a few of these things on the shutter speed. So first up, on top of the camera, we'll go ahead, press in the lock button, switch it over to the shutter priority mode. Let's kind of swing around here and take a look on the back of the camera. So let's immediately get us into a normal shutter speed range. So down here at 125th of a second, the way we have our camera set up right now is we're getting an aperture of f9. Okay, that's fine. Easy to take a photo there. Let's go to some faster shutter speeds, and you'll notice that our aperture is dropping. Now this lens's maximum aperture is f4, so I can shoot a picture here, and I'm going to get a solid exposure. Now, if I go a little bit further to 1,000th of a second, you're going to see the light meter over here comes down 2/3 of a stop, and the f4 is blinking, which lets us know F4 is not wide enough and we're 2/3 underexposed. Now, the further we go, the more this meter shows us that we are underexposed. And while it may look okay here in the back of the camera, if I shoot a photo and I play this back, that is a very underexposed photo, folks. That is a bit of a problem. Okay, so let's get this back to the normal range by going the other direction. Now we can have it go kind of south on us in the other direction as well. If we're trying to choose too long a shutter speed, I want to do a 1 second exposure in here. F22 isn't small enough, and it's going to be an overexposed photo by quite a bit. Take a look at that. Yeah, that's pretty ugly. Okay, so keep an eye on the blinkers. Now, one of the ways to solve this problem, the first way is just to dial it back to get into an area where you have an aperture that does work with it. Okay, that's proper solution number one. Solution number two is you can change the ISO to a higher or lower number, or you could change the ISO to an automated setting. So if we were to change ISO to auto, and I know I haven't fully explained ISO, but a lot of you know what I'm talking about, or you will later on in this section. So I now have it in auto ISO, and as I change my shutter speeds, let's go back up to 1,000th. Well, auto ISO is just kicking in and bumping up to a higher number. So I can shoot at 8,000th of a second here in the studio. Don't normally have that much light in here, but when we have the ISO bumped up that far, let's go ahead and take another look at that. And so, yep, that's good exposure. So if we want to dial down to a really long exposure, I don't know if we can get down to a full second here, but let's take a look. Past it. There we go. Looks like we can. Did we get a proper exposure? We did. So that auto ISO kind of jumped in and saved the day. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off again. So for some of you a little bit more knowledgeable people that are used to using auto ISO and shutter priority, it can work for some situations very well. It's one option when you know you have or you want the right shutter speed and you know what that is, and you want to let the camera figure everything else out. But be aware of the blinking aperture. It's a good, important warning to be aware of. All right, next up is aperture priority, and I hate to play favorites, but this is one of my more favorite modes for simple shooting. This is where you get to set the aperture, camera sets the shutter speed, and I like this because there's a limited number of apertures and you can very quickly dial back and forth from one extreme to the other. If you want lots of depth of field, you stop the aperture down to f16 or 22 or whatever's necessary. If you want shallow depth of field, you open it up to 2.8, 2.14 if you have it on your lens. And so you have a wide variety of things that you can do very, very easily. And because there are so many different shutter speeds on the camera, it's extraordinarily rare that you will ever have a blinking shutter speed. It's possible, but extraordinarily rare that you would have that come in. So let's go ahead and take a look on the camera. We'll go ahead and move the mode dial over to the A setting. We'll take a look on the back of the camera here. We'll see it's in the A setting, and we're now changing our apertures with our front dial. That's kind of our default aperture setting. And you can see here, if I want lots of depth of field, let's see if we can go down to f22. Yep, not any further than that. We're at 1/20th of a second. Take a photo there, proper exposure. Let's go the other direction. F4 there, take a photo there, play that, proper exposure there. And so we've got a lot of range very quickly back and forth. If we were to drop our ISO, because our ISO is up kind of high right now, let's drop it down to 100 and see what happens. So if we close our aperture down, we're going to get a long shutter speed of 1.6 seconds. All right, I can handle that on a tripod. Let's go ahead and open it up. Maximum aperture is only 1/20th of a second. That's fine on a tripod. But you see how it's very rare that you will run out of shutter speeds. There's just so many different shutter speeds that you can set. Aperture priority, you're almost always going to have something to work with. You do want to make sure that the shutter speed is appropriate to what you're doing, and if you're hand holding the camera. If it says a half a second and you're hand holding the camera, may not work out too well. I think you're going to need a little bit faster shutter speed in that particular case. All right. On to my favorite mode, manual. This is where you get to have full control. You're setting shutter speeds yourself, you're setting apertures yourself. You're going to use the main dial on the top back of the camera for your shutter speeds, and then in front, reach around up there and you adjust your apertures. Now this is where you're going to have to pay attention to your light meter to make sure that you're getting your images properly exposed. Now the reason I like manual exposure is because you get consistent results as long as you have consistent lighting. And so sometimes you'll have something happening and you want to get a variety of shots, variety of angles, different points of view, and you just want to shoot very quickly with all the same shutter speed and aperture. And you can do all that moving around and you're going to get the exact same exposure results between all your different images. It's also really good when you're in tricky lighting situations that the light meter, as good as it is, may have an issue with. And so under really bright lights or under very low light situations, you can dial things in, do a few test exposures, and then you can end up with consistent results in tricky lighting situations. Now, when you are in the manual mode, I want to talk a little bit about setting shutter speeds because there's a lot of options, a lot of things to know about. Now, the shutter speeds that I'm listing are what I call the whole stops of shutter speeds. So they generally double or cut in half with each one. And in reality, you have third stops between all of them so that you can have a very precise setting on the camera. I'm not showing them to you on screen because they clutter up my screen too much. So I'm going to avoid doing that here for simplicity reasons. Now, when you dial down below 30 seconds, you're going to get to a mode called bulb. And this is a long time exposure mode for nighttime photography, typically. This is where you press down on the shutter release. The shutter stays open as long as you want it, and then you can take your finger off the shutter release and that stops the exposure. This is something that many people would use for photographing fireworks. They'd open up the bulb, they'd wait for a firework burst, and then once it burst, they would release their finger because they need to kind of manually time those things. Now, a similar option is called time. And this can be a little bit handier for people who are doing something for a longer period of time. The idea is that you press the button once, that opens up the shutter, and then you wait, I don't know, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, as long as you want, go back, press it again, and that turns off the exposure. And so that could be good if you want to leave the shutter open, say, for 5 minutes, because you wouldn't want to have to stand there with your finger on the shutter for 5 minutes. One, that would probably get kind of sore doing that. Number two, you'd probably move the camera, vibrating the camera because you're touching it. And that's why you might want to be using a cable release or some sort of remote system in that regard. All right, now if you dial a little bit further, you're going to get X 1/200. And that is the flash synchronization, the maximum speed you can use with flash units. And so if you're working in the studio or you got an on-camera flash, 1/200th of a second is the maximum shutter speed. Sometimes people are in studios and they don't want to bounce around slightly too high or slightly too low, so they'll just throw it all the way into the X mode, and that way it's kind of at the end of the spectrum where there's less room for making mistakes, you might say. Now, one of my favorite features on this camera and some other Nikons as well is the extended shutter speeds. I like to do nighttime photography, and it can be really frustrating because 15, 30 seconds, great, switching back and forth. But what if I want to go to a minute? Well, then I got to put the camera in the bulb mode and I got to get my cable release out. And it just kind of changes the whole game going over 30 seconds. But in this case, you can go into custom menu D9 and turn on extended shutter speeds, which I think is awesome. And that way you can just dial down all the way to 900 seconds. Now, there is something peculiar about this that I would love to ask somebody at Nikon because it doesn't make a lot of logical sense, and I want to make sure that you know about it because if you are a nighttime photographer, this is going to be really important. Now, as we take our standard shutter speeds, they go in third stops from 15 seconds, 20, 25, 30. Okay, beautiful, working perfectly, I love it. All right. Nice, even third stop changes. All right, now let's add in our extended shutter speeds, okay? Let's add in minutes so you know how many seconds we're talking about here as well. Now, if you're just kind of changing from 15 to 20, 25, and 30, you know that you're getting a little bit more light in, third of a stop each time. When you jump from 30 to 60, that is a full stop because you have doubled that number. The next increment is a half stop. So when you go from 25 to 90, you're changing 1/3, one stop, and a half stop. And I have no idea why. you are, I don't know how to change it. Just be aware of this. And so if you are changing shutter speeds in that 30th to a 90th of a second, it's not in even increments. So if you said, oh, I need this just one stop brighter, well, that's going to be a different number of clicks depending on exactly where you are. Now, if you haven't done any nighttime photography, it's a lot of fun. Go out there before the sun sets, and that blue hour is a really good time, as well as full nighttime, looking for things that are going to look good in the nighttime exposure. This is about a 2-minute exposure showing you the trail lights of cars on the freeway all streaking past. And so a lot of fun things that you can do in there. Now, when you are using the manual exposure, you're going to need to be using the light meter. So the light meter has third stop increments with slightly larger marks at your full stops of over and under exposure. And so you can get your very precise readings in here. Now, if it does go all the way to the end and you see that little arrow off to the edge, that's going to be your over 3 stops or your under 3 stops. And normally you want to have that exposure right there in the middle. So let's go ahead and take a look on our camera. First up, on top, we're going to change it to the manual exposure mode. Then we'll go ahead and take a look on our camera. All right, just where we are right now, we're at ISO 100. That's kind of a separate setting. We're going to leave it there for right now. I'm looking at a photo that looks a little on the overexposed side for right now. Now let's just say we want to work with our apertures first, and I would like a nice middle aperture of f8. So I'm going to go down to f8. All right, so I like my f8. I'm on a tripod right now, so I don't care where my shutter speed is. I just want to get a proper exposure. So now the meter on the back of the camera goes up and down, which I kind of like because overexposure, underexposure, that makes a logical amount of sense. I kind of get that. When you look through the viewfinder itself up here, it's going to be along the bottom, and then you're going to have left and right, and things may be a little weird, and I'm going to explain that much later in the class. But for right now, we want to change our shutter speeds to get our light meter correct. And so you can just turn this so that it gets to the 0 setting, and that's a pretty good place to take your first exposure. Now, in this particular case, this focusing box that I have here is a little bit brighter than average. And so if I wanted to get the proper exposure, I would probably set this to either overexposed 1/3 and maybe in this case overexposed by 2/3. And that's because the white is brighter than average and I need to kind of get the meter to mimic what this is in real life. And so I think that's probably my proper exposure right there. Now, on those shutter speeds we were talking about, let me just quickly show you as we dial down to our longer shutter speeds. We'll go down to 30 seconds. Oops, past it. There's our 30. There's our bulb mode. And then we have our time mode. And then we have our X mode, 1/200th of a second. And I don't have the extended shutter speeds turned on right now, but if you did, you would see them between the 30 and the bulb. And so if you have any at all inclination that you're going to be doing nighttime work, or you need something beyond that 30-second, I would encourage you to turn on those extended shutter speeds, because I don't like being restricted, like you can't go into this area on the camera, you can't use these features. No, I'm the owner of the camera. I want to access anything and have it there. The main reason for turning it off is if you never use the camera in that mode, you're going down to use the X 1/200th of a second, the X sync speed, and you just don't want to have to turn the dial past those numbers that you never ever use. So quick thoughts there on that. All right, next up is the U1, 2, and 3 modes. And so these are for your user favorite settings. So this is where you can set the camera up to have your preferred exposures and menu settings for different types of photography. Now, the way this works is that you first just set the camera up the way you like it to. Then you dive into the setup menu under Save User Settings, and you save that collection of settings onto your camera under 1, 2, and 3. And so you can always kind of switch to those. So in reality, you actually kind of have 4, because there's kind of the normal mode you're in, whether that's manual or aperture priority. And then when you switch over to the U1, 2, or 3, then it switches everything over. And then when you go back to manual or aperture priority, It goes back to wherever you had the camera before. So let's go ahead and kind of assign some functions up here. So in this case, I'm not going to put the camera in the U1, 2, 3 mode because I need to program this in first. So let's say our first setting, rotate our camera here, is I want the camera in the aperture priority mode, and I like an aperture or aperture of f8. We're there. I'm going to set an ISO of 800. And then I'm going to go into the I menu. We'll talk about this more later. Let's go ahead and change the image quality to a fine quality JPEG. This will make sense in a moment, folks. You know, I don't normally shoot there. Let's set this to continuous low for the drive mode. And let's call it good there. Now, I'm going to dive into the menu. And I'm going to come over to the wrench. You got to go up and down on the left to the wrench. We're going to go to Save User Settings. We're going to save this as U1, and I'm going to hit OK, and that's saved in there. So then I'm going to hit the menu to back out, shutter release to back out. Now, on the top of the camera, I am going to switch to the manual mode, and I'm going to change my aperture to f16. And I'm going to change my shutter speed to a 30th of a second. And my ISO down to 100. Oops, wrong direction. 100th of a second. I'm going to dive into the I menu. We're going to set this on a 2-second self-timer. And I'm going to come over here to image quality, and I'm going to put this on raw. Now I'm going to dive into the menu, and I am going to save this as my user 2 setting. And we're going to save that. Okay, now I need to reset some of these things. So I'm going to reset this back to single. I am going to put my camera in shutter priority just to have something very different. Okay, so if I'm shooting photos and I want to go to my U1 setting, which is maybe my just street shooting mode, I don't know, street photography. Okay, so when I kick it over here, it's in aperture priority, ISO of 800, f8, and we've got our JPEG quality, and so it's kept a lot of those settings. Now, if I switch it over to U2, you can see the ISO is instantly switched over to say this is more of a landscape mode, f16, and so the drive mode did not keep, but the image quality mode did. And so that was something kind of noticeable. It doesn't keep everything, but it keeps a number of things so that you can quickly change from one mode to the next. And so if you like doing 3 different types of photography and there's a lot of adjustments changing from one mode to the next, this is a good way to save those settings ahead of time so that you can quickly jump over to that mode. So there you go, folks. That's the mode dial. Now, there's a good chance that you, me, and other people are not going to use all the modes. That's perfectly fine. Pick 2 or 3 that you really like to use, and those are the ones that you're regularly going to bounce between all the time. And so I encourage you to give a setup to those user 1, 2, and 3 modes and see if you can make use of those, because that'll save you time out in the field. All right, folks, that was your mode dial. Let's move on to the next factor, which is ISO. This is a really important one. So we do have an ISO button placed in a great spot on this camera, in my opinion. And so this is controlling the sensitivity of the sensor. It's kind of like the different types of speed films we had back in those days. And so this allows you to make that sensor a little bit more sensitive to light or less sensitive. And the main control is by pressing down on the ISO button. Remember, you have to keep your finger down on it while you're turning the dial on the back of the camera. Now, this is where the Z6ii and the Z7ii are slightly different. Okay, so on the Z6ii, the native base ISO is 100. If you want the best image quality, you want to set the camera to 100. As you go higher, you're going to get more noise. If you go lower, you're going to have less dynamic range. On the Z7ii, they have it a little bit different. Their base ISO is 64. So once again, if you go higher, you get more noise. If you go below it, you're going to have less dynamic range. Now, how much of this affects your images? Well, let's go ahead and take a look. First up is the Z6ii. We're going to take a crop of our standard image here. We're going to shoot it at all different ISOs and put your nose to the screen, and you probably won't see much difference in this row of images because the camera shoots very clean through ISO 3200. So let's go to the next step. And here we can start seeing some difference. And if we work our way from the right to the left, yeah, those 200, 100,000, they're going to be very noisy there. 51,000, yeah, that's still pretty noisy. 25,000, it's becoming pretty acceptable. And I could see shooting at 12,800 for a lot of things where people would never notice that extra noise that you have in the image at that place. Now that it is there, and if you get close enough, yeah, I can see it. But I'm thinking about most images in most places, that's going to be kind of a top end. 6,400, 12,800, I think, for a lot of people. All right, let's take a look for the Z7ii. All right, we got more megapixels. I'm not expecting as good a results here. Once again, on this first row, it all looks pretty good to me. So we're going to have to look at the higher ISOs to really see where we're getting a lot of noise. Now this tops out one stop less than the Z6. And so somewhere in the ISO 6400, 12,800 is where I think a lot of people are going to draw their limits as to where things start to become a noticeable problem. I think on many images shot at 3200 or less, no one will ever know unless you're making gigantic enlargements or huge crops of those particular images. So that's your basic ISO settings. Now, if you turn the front dial while pressing the ISO button, that turns ISOs on and off. And so let's go ahead and take a look at some of these ISO settings on our camera. So let's make sure I got our camera on here. Now, pressing the ISO button on the top of the camera and turning the back dial, we do get these third stops in the ISOs, and that's perfectly fine. If you want to be very exacting about it, you can do that. So this is a Z6ii that I am working with here. Its top numbered ISO is 51,200. And if we go up a third of a stop, it goes high 0.3. This is one stop higher, so it's, let's just rough it out and call it 100,000. And this is another full stop higher, and that's roughly 200,000 higher. On the low end, takes a while to get there, we go from 100, we go down a third, 2/3, and a full stop. So this is equivalent to ISO 50. In my opinion, they should just call it ISO 50. That's what it is. Now the problem with shooting at this low 1 or ISO 50 is you get about one stop less dynamic range. And so if you have a wide-ranging scene from darks to brights in there, ISO 50 or that low 1.0, not the best thing to use. I'll sometimes use it when I'm really desperate for just one more long shutter speed. I'm trying to get from a half second to a full second because I'm shooting a waterfall or something. And it's under nice, even light. Won't have an issue doing it all. Not something you're likely to notice at all, but I wouldn't use it in an extreme lighting situation. Now there are more controls that you can have over the ISO in the photo shooting menu under ISO sensitivity settings. You'll have some parameters that you can set on the auto, the way that the camera works with auto and when it switches from one ISO to the other when it's in that mode. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the menu section later on in this class. All right, next up is exposure compensation. So this is an easy way to make your images a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. Like the ISO button, you're going to press in on this button and you can turn the back dial, and you can also work with the front dial. It doesn't feel very comfortable on the fingers, but you can do it if you want to. Now the idea here is that when you are in a semi-automated mode, it's a great way of adjusting where the camera is trying to put you at, because the camera is always trying to give you a proper exposure, as if it always knows what a proper exposure is. And so if we want to adjust it a little bit, you press in, turn the dial, and get your settings set. Now, depending on which screen you're looking at, you might see an exposure indicator or an exposure value. That's going to tell you you're a little overexposed or a little bit underexposed from what the camera is recommending. And so just realize that there's some different options in there. Now, this is primarily used, and at least I would recommend being used with the automated ones like program, shutter priority, aperture priority, but it can be used to fool the camera in the manual mode. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these options in here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and put our cameras in aperture priority mode because that's a nice simple mode. We're going to dial our aperture to f8 because I like f8. That's a good aperture. Now, first up, we're just doing a standard picture here. That looks like a fine exposure. Let's say we want this to be darker. I press down on the plus minus button right up here on the top of the camera, and I can dial down, do a -2 exposure here. I can press in on the exposure compensation and do, say, a plus, let's get exact here, let's do a +1 1/3 right there. All right, so if I play these images back, there's our +1 1/3, our -2, and our normal exposure there. Now, one of the most important things to know about is always reset this back to 0, okay? Otherwise, you're going to end up with some wrong exposures. Now, let's talk about the fooling the light meter thing. Okay, let's move our cameras over to manual, and let's go ahead and set up a proper exposure here. We'll go ahead and adjust our light meter right to the middle of the 0 here. Now, are you the type of person that resets all the clocks in the house 15 minutes ahead of where it really is so that you're not late? I know some of you are saying yes. I think that's crazy, but you know, do your own thing. That's kind of what's going on here, is that you can set the exposure plus or minus, and then you're always going to be trying to adjust for that. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So right now we have a perfect exposure, right? Let's go ahead and take a photo. Now, we are in manual up here, okay? So if I change my exposure compensation to +2, all right, and I take another photo, nothing is different. So here is the +2, here is the other one. See, I'm on picture number 13, picture number 14. There is no difference. So doing exposure compensation in manual physically does nothing to the camera. But you'll notice what it did to the light meter. Let's go back down to 0. And if I do a +2 exposure, all right, I'm trying to tell myself later on, I want you to do a +2 exposure. When I release my finger, it says, you're 2 stops underexposed. And so then the dumber version of myself comes up here and goes, oh no, look at this, I'm 2 stops underexposed. I need to fix things up here. So this is where we really want things. I want things in the middle. And now I take a photo, and that photo will indeed be overexposed by 2 stops. So I don't know this is something I would recommend for most people. And once again, reset back to 0. See, you would never know exposure compensation is turned on unless you were really paying attention to this little plus minus down here. So let's go ahead and turn it off. Doom, 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 and there it is. And now we don't have that little plus minus that down there in the bottom. And so pay attention to everything in the screen because there's some things that are really important. All right, that's a lot on exposure compensation. Moving on. Next up, metering. So metering is the way that the camera reads the light coming in the camera. Now the way you act on this, is the way you get to it, is you need to go into the I menu. You're going to use the multi-selector to navigate around down to that bottom row in the middle-ish is the metering option. And once you hit OK there, then you can select from the 4 different options. Let's take a look quickly at what these are. Matrix metering is Nikon's multi-segment metering system. It's using tone, color, composition, even distance to try to figure out what's going on in the scene and what's the proper exposure for it. This, in general, will do a great job in most every situation, especially mixed light situations, better than any of the others in my mind. Center weighted is the traditional metering system. This is what a lot of the cameras used, say in the 70s and 80s, where it concentrates most of the information from the middle of the frame. And it's a good, simple system. Spot metering can be very handy in some unusual and tricky lighting situations where you want to read the light in a very small, particular area of your subject, especially if your subject's surrounded by light or dark area. And finally, it's kind of a newish one. It's been on Nikon cameras for a number of years, but I still consider it newish. It's highlight weighted. And what it does is it looks for the brightest areas and it tries not to overexpose them. And this could work out very well for many people. I think a lot of people, like myself, are kind of stuck using matrix metering because it basically works for everything. And they haven't needed to go with a highlight weighted. But if you have found that you're getting overexposed highlights and matrix metering isn't totally working for you in some situations, I would experiment using the highlight weighted system because that's going to prevent those overexposures. You'll have to watch out to see if it's getting your exposure in the right spot and if it's not causing some areas to go too dark because it's underexposing images. But it's a good kind of alternate choice from that matrix metering system. But 99% of the users, 99% of the time, matrix metering will probably work for you. All right, making sure you get the right exposure, one of the things you want to check on is the histogram. Now, this is something that can be turned on while you're live view shooting, hitting the display button on the back of the camera. You might need to hit it a couple of times because there's a few options in there. And so a brightness histogram is going to show you all of your pixels, and it's going to show you where it lines up. If they're brighter, they're going to be on the right side of that chart. If they're darker, they're going to be on the left side of that chart there. And so an underexposed image is kind of mounted up to the left, and an overexposed image is mounted over to the right. Now you can also see this when you play an image back. Play an image back, and then if you go up and down, you can get to histogram information provided it's available to you. So this is one of my gripes about Nikon is they have some great features and they're turned off from the factory, from the get-go, and you got to go turn them on. And so let's do that. Let's go into the playback menu. We're going to go into playback display options and we're going to put a check mark by the overview so we can see the brightness histogram and by the RGB histogram so that we can see that as well. So here we go. Press the menu button to the left, up to the playback tab, coming down to the playback display options. So we could do all of these right now, but I'm just going to concentrate on what we're focused on. And one of them is the RGB highlights right here. And there's overview. But John, there is no overview. I don't see it. Keep an eye on that scroll bar over here on the right, folks. Nikon likes to have things on a long page and you got to scroll down, and we're going to hit either OK or to the right. And I'm going to go to, actually I think you need to go to the right here and then press OK. So now those are locked in. Let's just double check. So we got the checkbox by the RGB and we got the checkbox there. We'll hit OK. Now when we play back an image, we can go up, up, up to cycle through those options. There's our histogram, which looks pretty good, a little on the bright side. That's getting kind of stacked up over here on the right. Let's see if we can take a look at another image. That image is a little on the dark side, and that one looks like it's about right. So that's the proper exposure. Let's go up, and we can see the RGB histogram, and we can see how that looks different for different types of images. And so the white one is kind of the grouping of all pixels, and then it breaks the other ones out in that channel. And so I'm going up and down for more information and left and right. But the key to that is I had to go into that playback display and turn those features on. And if you're from Nikon and you're watching, just check them off. We want to know about this stuff. It's good to see it in there. All right, next up, live view settings. So when you look at the back of the camera or you look in the camera, is the image you see represented of what you're going to get on the final image? And so this is something that you can turn on or off, and there is a reason for it. Now, I like it on most of the time because as you can see on the left side of the screen there, as our image is getting brighter and darker, it's because we're changing shutter speeds. As I'm changing the shutter speeds, the exposure indicator is going up and down, and so the picture mimics the settings that I am changing. All right, next up, let's turn the feature off. Now this would be good if you are working in a studio or with flash equipment. You're going to have a nice constant view of your subject, and you can change your shutter speeds in this case, and you can see your exposure indicator go up and down. But that's where you'll be looking for exposure information, is exclusively on that exposure indicator. Whereas on the left side, you can actually look at the brightness of the image to determine if you're underexposed or overexposed. And this will be something we talk about a few more times because it's very important in this class. So if you want to adjust it, you go into Custom Menu D9, and you can either turn it on or off, depending on what type of photography. I think most people will want to have this on most of the time. Special situations, you'll want to have it turned off. All right, auto exposure lock. Now this is a feature some people use, some people don't care about. Decide for yourself. So the joystick on the back of the camera is also a button. When you press in that button, it'll do something called auto exposure lock and or autofocus lock, depending on how you have it customized in the custom setting menu. Now let me go ahead and show you the way this works. We will first put our camera into a semi-automated mode. It doesn't do anything in the manual mode because it is an auto exposure lock, not a manual exposure lock. So on the back of our camera, we're going to zoom in as tight as we can for right now. And currently we have 1/5 of a second set. And you'll notice that if we scan over here to the right, it goes to a longer shutter speed because it's darker over there. All right, same thing over there. So if we want to lock in that particular shutter speed, by pressing in on this button, the AEL pops up, and we can pan the camera over and take a photo over there with that shutter speed locked in. Without pressing that button, it starts changing on us. And so this can be handy when you are using one of the automated modes. You get the right exposure, but when you move it over a little bit, either something bright or something dark has thrown off the exposure indicator, you can just hold in on that button and reposition it. Now, if you don't care about this feature, you don't think you would use it, not to worry. Later on in this class, we'll talk about how to reprogram it and what sort of good options there might be. All right, want to get the right exposure? One of the surest ways of getting the right exposure is to shoot a collection of images at different brightness levels, and you can just figure it out later. And so this is something that's been very common in photography for a long time, but it's also used for a few different reasons. And so if you go into the menu under auto exposure bracketing, you'll hit up all the controls that is in here. Now, bracketing can actually do a number of different things. We're concentrating right now on exposure bracketing. The AE plus flash will allow you to adjust the flash power, which can be handy. White balance is another way of doing bracketing. You can also do it with a feature called active delighting. I'll talk about these other features here in due time. We're talking about auto exposure bracketing. Now, you can adjust the number of shots. You can do 2, 3, 5, 7, or 9, and you can also adjust the increment between the shots, depending on what type of purpose you're doing with this. So once again, this is a good system for making sure that you come home with the right exposures. It's also very handy for HDR photography. If you want to capture the light in a very wide dynamic range, it might be better to capture 2, 3, or more images of one scene and then use software to combine them all together. Now, this is something that can also be combined with exposure compensation. So you could have all of your bracket series on the dark side or on the light side, whatever you want. So let's go ahead and take a look in the camera here, and we'll do a little exposure bracketing. Alrighty, so we have our camera in Aperture Priority f8. That seems fine for this type of activity. We're going to come over to the photo shooting menu, come down to the right, and we're looking for exposure bracketing, which is going to be down here a little bit on this scroll bar. And so auto bracketing, we're going to go to the right to enter this mode here. Now we can select different modes. We're going to do auto exposure bracketing. We don't have a flash, and so the first setting and the second setting are going to do exactly the same thing right now as long as I don't have a flash. But I'm just going to try to do this the right way, which is auto exposure bracketing. Now, one of the things that just a little bit weird, they don't have an on and off switch. They have a 0F, or is that an OF? The different types of bracketing that you can do in here, 0F means it's off and you're shooting 0 frames of the bracket. Let's do a bigger bracket. Let's do a 5 bracket series. Now you can go up to 9. We'll do 5. Under the exposure increments, I've done a lot of bracketing. I've never done third stops. It's just not enough for my taste. I need a little bit more of a difference from one image to the next. One stops makes sense to me. You could go up to 3 stops. That's huge. We'll do 1 stop right here. So I'm going to hit OK right there. So now that's locked in. So what you'll see on the right-hand side of the camera is it's in the auto exposure bracketing, and you can see where it's going to shoot through these different exposures. Now, I can fire this shutter release 5 times and it will go through each one of those modes. Let's go ahead and do that now. 1, and you can see one of those marks is gone. 2, another one is gone. And so it's just kind of counting them down so that you know right there. Okay, so now it's still in this mode because you can see the auto exposure bracket is still turned on, and there they are. If I turn this camera into the drive mode, we'll just go low speed. That sounds fine right now. If I press down on the shutter release and I hold it down, the camera will fire through all 5 shots and then stop. Listen to this. Okay, so there it finished the series. So let's take a look at them. So here's our latest series. This looks like it's overexposed. Still over, under, and then our normal exposure. And then our previous set was going to look probably exactly the same. Now, again, one of the most important things you need to do in here is turn it off. So we're going to go into the menu, auto bracketing, come up here and go down to 0F. That's off, misspelled, or 0 frames. I think it makes sense. And we'll hit OK. And now we're out of it. So exposure bracketing can be a very useful feature. And as I say, remember, don't forget to turn it off. That's one of the things you can leave on, and it can kind of mess up your photos afterwards. All right, next up is high dynamic range. I mentioned this in the previous section. This is where the camera will shoot through different exposures and combine them into one final exposure, capturing highlight information and shadow information from 2 different photographs. Now, you can turn this on for a series of photographs if you're going to be doing a whole bunch of them, or you can turn it on for just one grouping. If it's kind of a one-off thing, the feature will then automatically turn off, and you don't have to remember to turn it off in that case. Normally, this will be kept off because this is kind of a special mode. Now, the HDR strength. You can leave it on auto, let the camera figure things out. I guess it'll do okay there. 1 stop will shoot exposures 1 stop off, or you can do 2 or 3. I've kind of found that you need 2 or 3 EV in most situations to really get a notable difference in what's going on. So here's an example of a standard shot versus 1, 2, and 3 EV shots. Now notice in the bottom third of the frame where things are the darkest, over on the 3 EV, it's trying to lighten up that shadowed area. Whereas on the top third, it's trying to darken that bright area. And so the bigger the exposure range that you shoot in, the more that it'll be able to control that. If you look at the histograms, you can see where it's kind of pushing and pulling some of that information as far as pulling the shadows up and trying to pull those highlights back. So the next option is smoothing, and that is how does it control the light to dark shadow areas? And you can get some very different looks here that you may need to experiment with yourself. But here's a quick example. You'll notice when there is a low smoothing between the high and the lows, it's got a pretty big jump as it tries to adjust the brightness there, and it looks a little bit awkward. And so that low smoothing is not one that I personally like. It's got a very unique look to it that may work for something you're doing, but does not look like a traditional or natural photograph, you might say. So as I say, you may need to experiment with this a little bit. Now, one of the options is that you can save individual NEF or raw images with the shoot. And this is something I would highly recommend if this is something that's very important to you, because if you have the original raw images, you can combine those in software and work them with much more finesse than you have with the camera controls here. The camera controls that are built into the camera are kind of blunt instruments compared to software that's designed for HDR. I've seen good HDR. I know there's some good programs out there that people are using. From what comes out of the camera, it's kind of a starter package for HDR. And so if you do want to save those raw images, you will get a composite JPEG, which might be fast and convenient to use. And that's good, but you'll keep those raw images so that you can work with it later. All right, another way of dealing with unusual lighting and hard to capture tonal ranges in a particular scene is to use the active delighting. Now, this is something that doesn't matter with raw images and really only applies to JPEG images. And so in here, what it's doing is it's doing kind of like the HDR shot, but it's trying to do it in one shot, basically just getting the best exposure possible and then using software to lighten up the shadows and prevent the highlights from going too light. And so here you can see a standard JPEG versus the application of this feature at different levels. Yep, the shadow areas are becoming lighter, the light areas are becoming darker. There is a little bit of a funky roll off between the highlight and the shadow areas. And so if you are shooting JPEGs and you are trying to get a more finished look off of them that corrects for a wide exposure range, maybe normal, maybe high, maybe low, depends a little bit on the situation you're shooting in. You may need to do some testing for yourself to see what works right for your type of photography. All right, folks, that was a big section. There's a lot of things to go on in exposure controls. Hopefully you figured out some new things about your camera, some ways to move forward on this. Now, good time for you to take a little bit of a break because the next couple of sections are going to be really big and just as important as this one because you want to make sure you got the right exposures and right focus, critical issues. So I'll see you back here in the next video. See ya.